Welcome to this session about reshaping EU-US relations. We have here an extremely interesting concept paper, and two of its authors, Mr. Padoa-Schioppa, who is here, and Romano Prodi are here. I'm going to be very brief. I don't believe in long introductions, which is usually what people say when they start speaking for 20 minutes. I promise you that I will not. I just want to make a few, how should I say, dispirited or dyspeptic remarks on the subject of EU-US relations. You may know that there was an election in the United States with bizarre results. But nothing is really much more bizarre than the way in which European affairs are reported in the American media. 9/10 of the time, the media do not really mention Europe, except when there's an article about gastronomy or tourism. But in much of the press, not to mention television, Europe simply seems to have disappeared from the radar. I don't know what has replaced it, except tea parties and the like. But it ain't there. When it is there, and I'm thinking about the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, it is usually wrong. There is a pattern which I find interesting and to some extent amusing. On day one, you will find an article telling you that the eurozone is collapsing, that the deficits of country A are spreading to countries B, C, D, E, and F, that in fact the 27 members cannot reach any agreement, and that the whole exercise known as the EU isn't going to live much longer. On day two, an agreement is reached among the members in Brussels or wherever. On day three, the paper spends 3 lines mentioning it, but in very small characters. On day 4, it starts all over again. After a while, you wish for something a little different. But no, this has been going on now for weeks and weeks. I think one needs a professor of political psychology to explain it. I have a very simple word to explain it, which is a German word, which is Schadenfreude. Things are not particularly brilliant in this country, politically especially. The Europeans haven't even been capable of producing the equivalent of tea parties or the equivalent of Sarah Palin. So Europe can still be seen as it's worse than what we do, even if it's false. But it is depressing. It is depressing because it says a lot about the media, and anybody who studied or observed this election campaign knows how awful the media have been on the whole. It is bad for fostering or sustaining the interest which has existed for so long in European affairs. Now, it's understandable that people are also interested in what goes on in the rest of the world, which is obviously coming into its own with enormous problems. But it's high time that countries like China and India and Brazil are in the newspapers. But that doesn't mean that Europe should be reduced to a sort of has-been of no great interest. And it's particularly bad if you're a teacher and want to have students. But that's a purely professional remark. So what is good about this paper is that, should I say for once, but you can rayer les mentions inutiles. You can cut out for once. It's not bromide. It's not, yes, we have our problems, but everything is basically fine. It's a searching paper, and it is certainly much worth discussing. So since I said I would be brief, I think it's time to discuss it. Yes.
Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to discuss this paper in this place. I have no qualification to speak except to be the president of Notre Europe. I'm an economist, I'm not a political scientist. I have been all my life an official. Just by accident, I became a politician for 2 years. And I'm not a Harvard student. Worse, I am an MIT student. So I hope you forgive me for being here. 2 words just to present Notre Europe for those of you who do not know it. It's a research center, a European research center based in Paris, unlike most European think tanks which are Brussels-based, created by, and I would say for, Jacques Delors, when Jacques Delors left Brussels and returned to Paris after 10 years as president of the Commission, by Jacques Delors because it is his creature, for Jacques Delors because it was a kind of a gift or sign of distinction that the European Council, particularly Helmut Kohl and François Mitterrand, set up for him to permit him to continue in full independence to pursue its action for Europe, which is what he did. I think European affairs are the only ones on which he speaks publicly, and Notre Europe has been his base, is still his base. He chaired it and led it until 2004. Pascal Lamy succeeded him, but a year later he was elected to the WTO, so he left, and I was asked to become the president, and since then I am the president. I had met Jacques Delors in '79 when he was first elected in the European Parliament. It was an instant chemistry that developed, and for many, many years in the different positions he had and I had, we have done a number of things together. Europe is to some extent a conspiracy, and certainly we were conspiring together on many things. We are here in a little tour of 1 week to present this report, but also to present Notre Europe, and hopefully to establish contacts with persons in this country who are interested in studying European affairs and EU-US relationships. So any of you who wishes to either leave us coordinates or ways to remain in touch after this occasion would be most welcome for us. And maybe we could discuss some further ways to stay in touch. The origin of this report, or the idea to work on this report, dates to the first half of 2009, when the sense was strong in Europe and at Notre Europe that a new phase of politics was beginning both in the United States and in Europe. The United States with the new administration, in Europe with an incoming election, an incoming new parliament, an incoming new commission, and an incoming revised treaty, Lisbon Treaty. The sense was that this new phase could only be better than the previous one because, at least in Europe, the sense was that US-EU relationship had never been as difficult and marked by mutual incomprehension as during the 8 years of the Bush administration. That was not the only reason for difficult relationship. Certainly, Europe was deeply divided and incapable to cope with the challenges of those years. The idea was so to try to rethink the EU-European relationship, to some extent also to sort of compensate for the fact that, in our view, neither in the United States and even less, much less in Europe, a fundamental rethinking had been done when the Soviet bloc collapsed and World War III, if we want to call it this way, ended. In a way, EU-US relationship had been shaped by the threat of communism and the Soviet Union. They were cemented by a military alliance, but the fact that these foundations were no longer there was not triggering, did not trigger after 1989, 91, a fundamental rethinking. And that event certainly had caught Europe unprepared. Many, as you know, many European countries had strong reservations on German reunification. The EU had not completed its construction to the point of being able to offer the most desired good by the Central European countries, which was security. Security was provided by NATO. NATO extended its borders in a way that was perceived, rightly or wrongly, by Russia as an expansion and as a threat. There was a very long period, 10 and more years of antechamber before the former countries of the Comecon could become members of the EU. It was striking that the German Democratic Republic could be integrated into Germany in a matter of weeks, whereas it took 10 years for all the other countries to join. Why was it not possible to do what Eastern Germany did, namely go to vote simultaneously for an election and for an accession? Simply because the Union was not a union, in spite of the project set up in 1950. In 1990, it was not yet a union. So this report is also based on the idea that it was time to make explicit that the challenges today are different and that the EU-US relationship cannot be built on the premises of a past historical phase, has to be built on the what the challenges are today. The sense we have is that the main challenge is no longer security, is globalization. The main cement of the relationship is no longer military. It is cultural, economic. That the world is no longer bipolar. It has proven not to function as a unipolar world. The 8 years of the Bush administration have demonstrated that. It has to be accepted the fact that it's multipolar. The challenges are coming from private actors more than from public actors compared to the past. They do not come from states, they come from markets, from ideologies, for mental attitudes, for groups which are organized very often in a private way, including the private use of arms that characterizes this phase of the international scene. And they are not primarily territorial or ideological. They have a more elusive nature. They concern entities or things such as stability, influence. It's what is threatened is not really the control of the territory. All these challenges have the characteristics of exceeding, in the view of the authors of the report, the means that individually can be mobilized and used by the United States and by Europe. Not only by Europe, it's relatively obvious, but it's true also for the United States. There is a gap between the size of the challenge and the means to address it, not only the economic means, but also sometimes the intellectual, conceptual, cultural, and institutional means. Europe is clearly an incomplete construction which lacks the institutional strength to be an actor. The complexity and the design of the US institutions seen from the outside, from interlocutors of the United States, is also sometimes a source of difficulty in the interrelations. For instance, it's very hard, I have experienced that myself, to deal with a country when the matters that are the object of an international interaction and effort to strike agreements is not the executive but the legislative power, which is not an easy interlocutor in a negotiation. And so the uncertainty for outsiders always whether in the end Congress will ratify what has been agreed after months and sometimes years of negotiations. So against this background, the group tried to formulate what in the American terminology for these kind of things is called a doctrine, namely not a specific operational proposal, but a guiding approach, a set of concepts that is sufficiently precise to be to allow to verify whether a specific proposal is consistent or inconsistent with it, and which has the potential of being applicable to a number of areas. In this case, it could be financial stability or energy policy or security or the protection of the environment. This guiding concept should be susceptible of multiple applications. This doctrine that is proposed here is based on two very simple concepts, which are the idea that the challenges that come from globalization should be addressed on the basis of the acceptance of two notions. One is multilateralism, the other is the need of limited but clear sharing on sovereignty to address problems that are truly global and require a global solution. And we feel that these two concepts, these two guiding principles have, and the report has a number of examples, not in-depth research on specific fields of application, but a number of examples showing that in areas such as securities or the resolution of the tensions in the Middle East in particular, or the pursuit of financial stability and the better governance of the world economy, or energy and climate issues, these two concepts may be the basis for approaches that may be adequate to the global nature of the challenges. Let me conclude by saying two more things. One, as you have seen, the group is composed of a number of very distinguished members of Notre Europe and former members of the European Council, people who have been intensively involved in European affairs. Two former prime ministers, Jacques Delors, Joschka Fischer, Jerzy Buzek, Paavo Lipponen, three former prime ministers. It's a report written by a group of Europeans. We felt that it would have been appropriate to start with an internal discussion in Europe, since Europeans so often address the United States well before having agreed among themselves about what their position is. So it's to be seen as a first step to stimulate a discussion in Europe and to approach a dialogue with personalities in the United States, possibly in a second phase. The second point I would like to make is that as a consequence of that, the spirit of this presentation is to get feedbacks and ideas and stimulus to continue this work, and possibly to make it at some stage a joint effort for research and discussion. Laurent Cohen-Tanguy, whom you know well because he has taught at Harvard, has studied at Harvard, has all the qualifications that I don't have, will make some further remarks to give you the flavor of another eminent member of Notre Europe who was not in this task force and who has, with some respects, views which may here and there differ, while I think concurring with the fundamental approach. So I think it's good if Laurent takes the floor and complements my remarks. Thank you.
Just a few remarks. In fact, yeah, I was not a member of the task force, which gives me a little bit of freedom to add some nuances. And you may know, Notre Europe is a very democratic organization. We have some very heated debates, and so I'm a member of the board of directors of Notre Europe, and this board is quite has a particularity to engage in substantive discussions and not only housekeeping matters. So that makes some very interesting discussions about the state of European affairs 3-4 times a year. On transatlantic relations, I wrote a book a few years ago, actually, during the height of the Iraq war and probably one of the worst tensions in transatlantic relations in 2002, 2003. And at that time, I found myself in France among a very small group of people trying to advocate the primacy of the Atlantic Partnership over whatever disagreement there may be on the Iraq War, whereas most people on both sides of the Atlantic, the neoconservatives over here and a number of anti-Americans of various horizons in Europe, were sort of stressing the huge differences in interests, values, etc., that would lead to an unavoidable transatlantic divorce. And then sometime later, even during the second Bush administration, things started to improve, and all the more so with the change of government in both Germany and France, with the arrival of Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy, and then the election of Barack Obama. There was a sense that transatlantic relations had again reached a much better place. And today there is some disillusion on both sides, which probably also results from the excessive expectations that both Obama's election and possibly the hopes that Europe was going to change and become a more serious international actor created. So I have a few questions about the report, which I find a little bit too optimistic, to summarize. A little bit too optimistic because I think that since 2003, which is the date I wrote my book, An Alliance at Risk, and today, the world has changed so much with, in particular, the rise of the new powers in Asia, China, India, the return of Russia, and with the global economic and financial crisis, which has in fact accelerated this change, that things are quite different from what they were 5 years ago. And so what I'm asking myself are the following question. If the goal of the new concept is for the US and the EU together to better manage globalization, I'm wondering whether the US and Europe have the same interests in managing globalization. In some areas they do, but that is not a given, and in some areas they don't. When they do, are they still able, are they still in a position to effectively influence globalization? Are they still in a position to make a difference? The answer is yes, it's certainly better. They have a better chance to do that together than if they are at odds with each other. But I don't think it is any longer guaranteed that agreements and cooperation on any single issue of a global nature between Europe and the United States would be enough in the world of today, and even more so in the world of tomorrow. Another comment I would have is that I think that the focus on multilateralism is too European, in the sense that it's obviously part of the sort of European foreign policy identity. But unfortunately, one of the effects of globalization from a geopolitical standpoint is the rise of these new powers, is the return of some form of traditional geopolitics, competition for energy, natural resources, rise of nationalism, of continental nations. And so the whole framework of international relations, unfortunately, is looking more like the 19th century than a sort of postmodern European dream. And I believe that Europe has to adapt to that without obviously abandoning its values and ideals, but it has to go in that direction, and if not, it risks becoming irrelevant. And the US obviously doesn't have that problem. It is part of that sort of sovereignist culture. But thinking that, which is the European ideal and dream, that the world would become a sort of enlarged Europe is, in my view, more and more wishful thinking. And so I think we need to play on both registres in order to make a difference. This being said, I fully share the basic inspiration of the report that in today's and tomorrow's world, it is more and more critical that we do not let the Atlantic gap widen. And there are risks that the EU being more and more introverted and more nationalistic, and a return to what the report called the pre-Maastricht status, but there's a worrisome rise of nationalism, populism, extremism in Europe, especially in the crisis, and similarly the US becoming either interested in other areas of the world, finding Europe less and less relevant, less and less credible, or focusing on purely national or sometimes provincial issues. There is a risk that this gap will widen, and it would be obviously quite damaging in a world where the West is already weakening and will weaken even further tomorrow. So that I would just leave it to that.
Thank you, Laurent. To underline your last point and also what Stanley said earlier, let me quote you one sentence that I quoted to my students this afternoon from Maureen Dowd's comment, an attack on Obama in particular of last week in the New York Times, which concluded a rather strong attack by saying, and now he's trying to turn the US into a country, it's verbatim, like a member of the failed European Union, a France without food, which gives you an idea about what kind of notions do exist about the European Union, even in the elite. I also want to point out that the report is available outside, and if we ran out of it, I'm sure you can actually, there are no reports left? No. Oh dear. Okay. There is a web page, and you can download it at www.Notre Europe EU. So there are also other publications of Notre Europe outside on the table. The problem, of course, is not everybody has read the report, nor could you in those few minutes give all the idea, reproduce all the ideas. In the report, I have read it. It's rich in quite a number of ideas, and Laurent put already a question mark about behind one idea, which I would like to pose to one of the authors, and then we'll open up. Aren't you, by suggesting that sharing sovereignty is the precondition for being effective, aren't you extrapolating the European experience to the United States? Is the United States really ready to share sovereignty in order to deal with the global problems of the world? My question.
I think it's a rhetorical question by those who ask, namely the answer you expect or you have in mind is no. And indeed, there is very little indication that a fundamental change in attitudes is taking place. However, some degree of sharing sovereignty is already in place in a number of areas. And the most recent one is that the United States have lost their veto power in the IMF. To give an example, as a result of the last decision, unless again, I think this is it doesn't require ratification, so it is done. There are many areas in which international rules are indispensable to permit the functioning of international realities, navigation, air navigation rules. It's just I say that just to say that the ideology of unrestrained sovereignty is much stronger than the reality. And the first step is to observe that when the necessity is really compelling, there would be no possibility to fly safely if there was no if there were no clear rules for that. When the necessity is compelling, the acceptance of an international rule, of a degree of sharing of sovereignty comes. The problem is, therefore, to a fairly large extent, one of making the case for this necessity sufficiently persuasive and sufficiently strong to permit an evolution in areas where the only solution can be one involving a degree of shared sovereignty. I know that, I mean, you quoted an article to highlight the idea that the Americans have about Europe. That article conveyed also an idea that of what the American thinks of their president, it seems to me, which is for many Europeans somewhat surprising, I must say. I say that because the discourse of your president on these things has been completely different from the one of his predecessor and of several of his predecessors. That person was elected. There is a pedagogy in the public speeches of the President of the United States. It's not because this president is unpopular in this very moment that this change becomes irrelevant. So my answer to your question is that there is a necessity and there is a possibility of helping an evolution in this direction.
Floor is open. Chuck, would you please just give your name and your association?
Charles Cogan, Kennedy School. With a weakening Europe, there's a tendency to be more multilateral, and the example is there of this recent French-British defense and nuclear agreement, to which apparently the U.S. has no objection. Can you go back to 1963 and think of the Élysée Treaty and the fuss that the U.S. made? Things are evolving in a direction of multilateralism because of the decline of the West. What do you say to that?
Yes, I would have put it in a slightly different way because of the fact that the cost of fragmentation can no longer be borne. I think the Franco-British agreement is the result of the budget cuts of the new British Prime Minister, which are themselves the result of the crisis and of years in which the budget balance had drifted too much. there are areas in which the European Union right now is discovering the necessity of being united well beyond what was perceived, say, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, or before the crisis. The way the sovereign debt crisis in Europe is being handled is a recognition, sometimes a reluctant recognition of the fact that the union is much more a union than the governments and political leaders believed. The Franco-British agreement is another example of that. There may be similar developments on some aspects involving human rights. The measures against the Roma taken by France are clearly violating the treaty, and if they were persistently applied, they would probably bring to a procedure of infraction in which France would be inevitably defeated. It would be discovered that the rhetoric of sovereignty is a void rhetoric. So I am sometimes thinking that there are some respects in which the questions that Europeans have asked, or the pro-Europeans have asked for so long, when will the point of no return come, may be answered. It has already come, but we didn't notice. And the three examples I'm giving are, I think, pertinent examples in this respect. So it's not the decline, it may be the necessity.
Okay. Simon Kosher.
Simon Kosher, visiting scholar at the Weather Center. I just have a question. Well, the whole panel actually was raised before regarding the domestic dimensions and dynamics of the Transatlantic Partnership. The Tea Party was already mentioned on the American side, and the election results also display a lack of interest in foreign policy on the United States side. And I see a similar development in Europe evolving today as well, with the strikes in France, the Netherlands, with the immigration debate in Germany, and so on and so forth. And the defense agreement was also mentioned. It seems to me in 2003 we were talking almost too much about foreign policy, all the criticism of Iraq War, and now we're complete opposite. We're not talking enough about foreign policy anymore. Now we're talking over domestics on both sides. And I would just like to know what do you reply to that?
Well, I wouldn't say that the strikes in France about the pension reform are a sign of lack of interest in foreign policy. It's more that obviously the economic crisis has provoked many European countries and elsewhere, a return to national solutions and national concerns, and it's also that the international issues that are most pressing today are economic nature. I mean, dealing with the crisis, and unfortunately, all the rest is a pretty dismal state, whether it's Afghanistan or the Middle East, and there's no real focus, I think, at the highest level on those because of the pressing needs of the economic situation. And what you could say positively is that there are fewer areas of disagreement between Europe and the US on foreign policy matters than there used to be at the time of Iraq, if only because the situation is so deadlocked in many areas that there's even no room for disagreement. So there is clearly always a sort of isolationist tendency, and with the election in the US, I mean, that may actually increase. But I think the Europeans are always interested in foreign policy, if only because they do not have adequate security and defense capabilities, so they need to at least care about the state of U.S. interest in Europe, and there's always a fear that the United States will abandon, quote unquote, Europe or be less interested, which is, so that would be my answer to your question.
Julian Horwath.
Wondering, nobody has yet mentioned the word NATO. NATO is meeting, more or less as we speak, and is in a state of, to my mind, terminal crisis, which is being papered over with fine words and strategic concepts which are little more than words, speeches by Rasmussen saying this is the most important development in NATO's history, what is happening in Lisbon right now. And I think this is symptomatic of the problems of the relationship. That we spent a lot of time in the build-up to the Obama election reveling in how wonderful the transatlantic relationship was going to be once he was elected. But within months, we were disillusioned, partly by his speech at the NATO summit and then the cancelling of the EU-US summit, because we realized that what the United States is asking of Europe is that it get its act together, that it speak with one voice, that it brings something substantial to the table, and then the US will take it seriously. And this is precisely what the EU seems to be incapable of doing. And so the relationship has gone kind of fuzzy. And I think that all of the paper, the paper cracking over, what's the papering over the cracks that's taking place at the NATO summit is yet another refusal to face up to this fundamental. Laurent spoke of clashing interests, and I think that in many parts of the world we do not have common interests with the United States. And again, we don't really want to recognize that. And Afghanistan, in a sense, again, is emblematic of the problem. The United States sees the fight in Afghanistan, I think, as a kind of almost a moral responsibility, rightly or wrongly. The Europeans saw it very, very differently and really just can't get out. I suspect the Americans are getting close to that point now, but they still see it. I actually had General Stanley McChrystal in my class yesterday at Yale talking about what the Americans are doing in Afghanistan. There is clearly a belief that this is still something worth doing. I don't think that that belief was ever there in Europe. And one could multiply those sorts of examples. So I think there's a profound disjunction between the way the Europeans see the world and the way the Americans see the world. And it's not until Europe gets its act together that we can come back together and talk to one another as useful partners.
I completely disagree. Because it doesn't seem to me that the problem at present is essentially a NATO problem. It's largely an economic issue. There isn't going to be a major war on the horizon, I hope. And I don't think that what you say about Afghanistan is of sufficient importance in the whole scheme of strategy in the world. Especially at a moment when the US, painfully and perhaps clumsily, is showing the first signs of stepping out, even if it's only in 2014. I mean, the main problems that they all face, United States included, are economic problems. It's not military problems. So the fact that the Europeans aren't putting their act together strikes me as slightly irrelevant. There hasn't been a crisis which would have, a military crisis, which would have required the Europeans to act as if we were in 1956 or at any moment of the Cold War. By the way, and then I shut up, the notion of the Europeans not being capable of putting their act together strikes me as an extraordinarily misleading notion. You have 27 countries that have spent most of their history fighting each other, are dealing with a constitution which is well, not much better than the American one, and the speed with which they have done things in common, compared with, let's say, the Europe of the 30s, is something which one has to keep in mind. To me, and I was a rather skeptic about at least possibilities of moving to a form of federalism. I never thought it was quite in the cards. I think it's one of the few reasons for being optimistic about international affairs. So that's, we can go on discussing this. But I don't see where the military crisis is, which would require the Europeans to once again align themselves in NATO behind the US. Where? Certainly not in Afghanistan.
Can I come back?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I was thinking much more about the debate through the 90s of going global. The United States was asking the Europeans support at a global level, not just military, but at a global strategic level. And the Europeans wanted nothing less than that because they didn't think in those terms. And that covers economics, it covers a whole range of policy areas. And I think that's still the case. I mean, I agree with you that Europe has done fantastic, made fantastic progress. But from an American perspective, it's peanuts.
Yeah, but you started your remark with saying that NATO was in a terminal crisis.
Yeah.
I don't see it because I don't think that it is NATO which is the issue at present.
I don't think
On
it's the
other
issue either.
issues,
I was
yeah.
drawing attention to the fact.
You wanted to react. Yeah. We are drifting farther away from areas in which I have any competence, but I have 2 points to make in this respect. One is that the Europeans are indeed divided among themselves on NATO, and this is why the EU-US relationship may be difficult there. Maybe 3 points. Second, the Europeans are unwilling to pay for their own defense, and this is a fundamental handicap, not only political, but also of legitimacy, in a way, in talking about NATO. And third, it seems to me, and I'm a layman, a profane, an alliance is different from a union because it's created for a specific purpose, and normally is a word that belongs to the terminology of security and war and peace. The peace was won. Normally, alliances are dismantled after they have achieved their objective. Clearly, NATO was more than that, or is more than that, because there were a number of institutions, values, historical traditions, which were the cement of that alliance and made it more than just an episode in history. But the fact remains that some of the difficulties with NATO, in my view, are related to the fact that the raison d'etre of it was no longer there after 1991. I realize that I'm close to heresy by saying that. It's not the rhetoric of NATO documents, but it seems to me that this issue has to be raised at some point. It doesn't mean that nothing should follow, but a rebuilt on new basis has been tried, but not really achieved.
The report for effective action talks of 3 conditions. The first, ground rules for the Euro-American relationship, and there it says, NATO should be a military instrument and no more. Secondly, second condition, overcoming the illusion about sovereignty in the European Union. Third condition, overcoming the illusion that American political hegemony can guarantee world order. I thought I should read what's in the report. Charlie.
I found the report in some ways very bracing and refreshing. I mean, it would have been nice perhaps if Europeans had told the United States that we were arrogant at the time, that the people you're criticizing were still in office, but at least you said that here. Second, it looks at a future where the weight, frankly, where the weight of Europe and the weight of the United States are relatively quite diminished in a world which we all know is happening. And so, and it's much better than a report I got from the Council on Foreign Relations, or not a report, a little bulletin which said, well, although American relative power is going down, we can still be number one, essentially. I mean, who cares? I mean, you just, it's not clear, but it's, I mean, who cares? We have to secure security, but still, I don't, but after that, I'm not sure what the report takes, where the report takes us, because these things that are told are, I mean, let me frank, you know, are sort of truisms. Of course, you know, it would be nice if we worked together, but you know, my frustration is not about NATO, and I tend to agree with you. We never really defined its mission after 1991 very well. But you know, and it's not just the American press which is ignorant. I read the Financial Times. I'm never quite clear whether that's an American paper or a European paper. It's very much a British paper. But you know, clearly Europe has concerns about, you know, what managing the eurozone is something which is a tremendous challenge, and there's little agreement on. And what does the report mean? We should sort of coordinate our world historical decline on the right level? Fine. You know, sort of, it's like it's, you know, think about euthanasia. Or does the report say, it's not saying we are not going to arrest this decline relatively, even if we coordinate it, because the facts are too stark. So you know, and then I don't quite see how to get from, you know, A to B. It's like the old fable of belling the cat. We know the cat has to get a bell on it, but who is going to do that, and how do we do it? And so I think this is the problem with all these reports, and I probably would have, you know, had I been asked, would have, you know, written the same thing. But when I read it, I do get a little despairing about what really is going to be done and how can it be done. We ask for good faith. I agree with Stanley in a sense, although the 30s were at very nasty powers within Europe that we don't have today. We have an administration which hopefully will not revert to a narrow-minded American firstism, but it's not at all clear. We have a Europe which isn't quite clear about aging, migration, management of a currency, or even, you know, what responsibilities it should take in the near abroad, to use another term. And so I'm not sure, you know, what do we do besides having conversations?
Would you like to react?
Yeah.
Coordinated decline.
As I said, I do like
No,
the
but
frankness of the diagnosis at the beginning, and that's a step forward.
What strikes me in your remarks is the central place you attach to the notion or the word decline. Why is it so important? Clearly, the relative position of both Europe and the United States is Europe has been declining throughout the past century, and the United States are perhaps realizing that a similar decline occurs to them. But is this so important? What is important is that there are challenges which have a global nature and which would be impossible to address, say, by the United States alone, even if there was no decline. implicit in the idea that the key element is decline is the idea that if there was no decline, then hegemonic power could solve the problems of globalization. I think this is a misconception. I'm not saying it's yours, but it may be the misconceptions of those who consider that the problem is the decline. If the solution is an acceptance of multilateralism, is an acceptance that in one way or another problems can only be addressed effectively by what is called sharing of sovereignty, it doesn't matter very much whether the influence of the United States is lower than it was maybe 20 or 25 years ago. The problem is how to use that influence, which is still extremely relevant. So I would say that the issue of decline is not a central theme.
Sure, Charlie, go ahead. I did not mean to specify. Frankly, I think when you know, one of my models for historical development is Sweden from the late 18th century on, which powers and places manage a different status in the world. So I'm not beset by decline, and I'm sorry if I gave that impression. But in terms of multilateralism, and these are joint problems, why, if the world is becoming more multilateral, why should there have to be a sense of privileged American-European approach? Why not a European-Chinese, European-Indian, whatever it is? What is it that we are, we have a lot of wealth still, and we will retain a lot of wealth. I shouldn't have been, if I stress decline, I shouldn't. But this transition to a more equipartition of influence, but with the same problems. And I don't see, a lot of these things are climate change. Yes, we're all, who can be against, very, but we, and I think we broke toward it together in different ways. We've got a big problem out there in the world, which is neither yours nor mine, in China and elsewhere on this. So I guess it's just the substantive types of cooperation. I fervently agree. It's nice when people can do these things together, but I'm not sure the other partners out there will be just as important.
Let me speak again for a moment, but then ask Laurent to say a word. Again, I think we should not confuse multipolarism with multilateralism. The fact that the world is multipolar is a fact. It's not a choice. Multilateralism is a choice. It's a policy. It's an attitude. It's a way to approach problems. And the essence of this way is to consider that what you have, so to speak, in front of you, or what you have to interact to, is the community of the other, or the complete set of the other, say, countries or powers, and not one by one. It's a fundamental, it makes a fundamental difference to have an approach in terms of bilateralism and an approach in terms of multilateralism. I could document that in fields in which I've been active professionally, in monetary affairs, in financial affairs, because if you make the step from bilateralism to multilateralism, you recognize that there is an international community. You recognize that your, say, obligations and rights are vis-à-vis a multitude, which by this very fact constitutes a kind of unity that has to be recognized as such. This may or may not be the approach to which the problems of a multipolar world are addressed. Multipolarism will be there even if multilateralism was refused as a method to address the issues. And so it seems to me that it is not obvious that in a multipolar world, multilateralism is the way to deal with problems.
Yeah, just say a word. And maybe, Charles, what you're saying is that there's something missing in the report, which is the commonality of values and issues of democracy, human rights, and especially in this new world where a lot of new powers do not share the same values, or there's an open challenge to the universality of values that we, the West, held universal and hold universal. And so it's true that this dimension is lacking. Maybe it is because the report didn't want to sort of set the West against the rest, but it is true that it is something that we have in common and that we do not have in common with China or other areas. And I don't know whether that's an answer to your criticism, but I think it is important to legitimize the approach, because if there was nothing, if it were only about interest, you could actually do the same exercise with other areas of the world, and it's true that in a number of areas the interests do no longer coincide, and so that would be my response to your comment. I mean, you didn't have that in mind.
Thank you. Michael Landesman.
Well, I'm also not a real scientist, so I'm talking on this name with you. But I was a bit concerned by, in the podium, people were talking also about the basis of this approach between Europe and the US is the concept of the West, yeah? And I think Charles Mayer also talked about the perception one has visiting the US is that there's a much more active approach towards recognition of, in some areas, there is more commonality, let's say, with India or with some other powers. So I think in Europe, in a sense, one is hanging back on something which is a sort of unchanging notion of a coalition of Western powers. So the adjustment to this multipolar reality doesn't seem to have sunk in that aspiration of a renewed relationship between the US and Europe. Or why is actually there not much more activity in relations with India or China? Even with Russia, there is not a very complex and rather inconsistent approach in dealing with that. And the Middle East, of course, is altogether pretty inactive from the European side.
I don't quite agree for the following reason. It seems to me that the notion of the West is fairly profoundly present in American foreign policy. India, you have a special problem, which is that we have had relations with India, especially during the Cold War, which were literally upside down. Here is a country which is, in some ways, a very Western country, and which, because of its closeness to the Soviet Union for a while, we, and I'm thinking particularly of my good old colleague Henry Kissinger, are pushed even further into the arms of the Soviets. And nobody, I think, in the United States sees China as a partner when it comes to human rights, when it comes to values, and so on. Well, that doesn't mean that the United States foreign policy should limit itself to celebrate its community with Europe, but I don't think that there is I think the notion is that you can move from this sort of community to dealing with growing countries and growing problems in the rest of the world, not much more than that.
Would you like to react to that point?
Yes, I hope I understood you correctly. I would refer to what Laurent said. And by the way, this is a point that was made yesterday when we discussed this report with both at NYU and at Columbia University, particularly with the Jean Monnet Fellows at NYU and Joe Weiler. We realize through these exchanges that the existence of what could be called a common heritage, which is broadly comprising Europe and the United States, although not exclusively, because there are this heritage is shared also by some countries or some regions which are not strict in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, in countries that will probably not become members of the European Union. But the bulk of it is comprised into the EU-US area. The report is silent of that, is not speaking at common values, common tradition, etc. And these exchanges convinced me that it was a mistake not to be explicit on it and in a way to presuppose them. And why was it not made explicit? I don't remember that a conscious decision to exclude this was taken in the discussions of the group. But if I had to interpret the reason, is that there was an attempt to construct on what are fundamental necessities and interests, and to avoid anything that may sound like the rhetorics about the common heritage, which has been abused so much and for so long, just to hide the void of capacity to address the real issues. So I admit that this is gives the impression that in the end, the US-EU relationship is a subject that can be discussed in the same way in which any pair of relationships in the world, and this was a point that you also made, and I think this is a mistake in the way we have expressed ourselves.
Next was the gentleman in the rear, please.
My name is Pietro Ravassi. I'm an MBA candidate at Harvard Medical School. I'm very glad that the has been brought to the attention the fact that the Cold War ended 20 years ago, and perhaps some of the tools that we are using on international affairs are not valued perhaps anymore. And we've got at the same time a scholar here at Harvard, who's Professor Nye, who's been framing a theory of a combination of hard and soft power, renamed as smart power, and also linking this, so on the one side there's this, and then the other side, the fact that there are emerging powers in Asia, and I'm very glad that that has been brought to attention now here. So I'd like to ask the panel and also President Padoa-Schioppa, what examples, concrete examples, you may suggest of smart power that Europe can have in tackling global issues, especially towards emerging powers in Asia, with or without the partnership of the US? Thank you very much.
Laurent, you want to start?
It's not easy. I was thinking about it.
No, one of the things, I give you an example, which is related to an activity that takes a fair share of my time right now. I am presently chairing the trustees of the International Accounting Standards IFRS Foundation, very esoteric subject of which I understand very little because I'm not an accountant. I will not become an accountant. I don't want to become an accountant. There is no chance at my age. but I understand the politics of it. It takes 3 or 4 minutes to explain. Accounting rules are, in a way, among those things that should be global, should be uniform globally. It makes no sense that, as it happened, Mercedes-Benz appears as a healthy firm on European accounting standards and an unhealthy firm on American accounting standards. It's the same. There is no reason for that. This refers to maybe 20 years ago, not to recent development. Europe was totally incapable to write its own accounting rules for 40 years or more. It's a European EU competence. There was an attempt to write directives on accounting principles. There was no agreement. At some point, this foundation, which I'm chairing, was created to a large extent as an American initiative. Paul Volcker was my predecessor in the chair of the trustees 10 years ago. And it was an incredible success story because today the accounting standards produced by this body are adopted in more than 120 countries in the world. One decisive step came in 2002 when this organization was 2 years old. The EU, being desperate of its incapacity of producing its own standards, elected the ISB its own standard-setting body. And so this was a big first step in making those rules accepted by the world. The transition countries, which didn't want to use American rules, they moved out of socialism to adopt the rules of the Temple of Capitalism, would have been an acknowledgement of defeat much too big. So they embraced the standards, and so did China, Russia, India, etc. The Europeans, instead of being happy, so it's a fantastic success of smart, how do you call it?
Power. Smart power.
Smart power, okay. The Europeans should be extremely happy. No, they are unhappy. They say that this is not their own organization, that the body that set the standards has 3 or 4 Americans in it, so that the Americans make their rules while the rules are not adopted in America because America has not yet embraced those standards, is the big exception. It's a perfect picture of the success and contradictions of smart power, and because Europeans should find that it is an enormous success indeed. And this is an example of many. There are many areas in which the rules and the economic legislation that was produced by Europe as part of the creation of a single market based on rules and not just of anarchy or about standards, norms, etc., are exported to many countries which will never be part of the European Union. Laurent, I stepped into your...
Well, you gave me the time to think, but I don't know whether I had the right idea or not. But one example that came to my mind is the role of the Europeans in making the G20 sort of the global governance forum. I think that it probably would not have happened without the push that Sarkozy in particular during the EU presidency of 2008 made in conjunction with the United States. And that's an example of sort of transatlantic agreement, something. Now, you may think that G20 is a bad idea, but if you regardless of that, it's true that the Europeans played a leading role in that, and it is now going forward. It's true that the returns of the G20 meetings are diminishing in the past 2 years, but it is still, I think, an important development, and where the Europeans have actually played a role.
Miriam?
Thank you. I'm Marielle Rouillet. I'm a French professor of political science visiting I have a conceptual question. Maybe it's a bit rhetorical or provocative, I don't know. You kept using the concept of co-sharing of sovereignty. I'm just wondering whether this use of the concept might not convey the traditional misunderstandings within the partnership between the US and the EU, because you might know that the European Union is supposed to have renounced sovereignty. This is arguable, but as opposed to the US, which has not renounced it at all. And it seems to me that in the very assessment of common operations that have been undertaken between the US and the EU in Afghanistan, for instance, this difference of view impedes the real assessment of what's going on. So, do you understand my question? Can you?
Not sure I understand.
Yeah. Does the use of co-shared sovereignty is really a pertinent concept? I would actually push you to use more creative concepts.
Well, let me put it in the simple terms that, in my view, are fundamental. Sovereignty means to have the ability to have a command over the issues and the problems and the needs. Sharing sovereignty in areas in which the good to be achieved is global and cannot be achieved individually by a country, in fact, is an ambiguous expression because the sovereignty that is shared does not exist. It has to be reconstituted by pooling an alleged sovereignty that is, in fact, powerless over the problems. If this is what you mean, I fully agree with you. It remains that in the language of politics, we do speak of sovereignty, and that governments are elected, for instance, with a presumption that they will be sovereign on a number of things in which they no longer are. So once suppose we agreed on this, then I'm quite open to reconsider the terminology, but I think there is no disagreement in substance. Now, to launch a different label to this concept may be complicated, because I think that people understand what is meant by saying that a degree of sharing of sovereignty is desirable.
Reflecting the growing interdependence, yes. Next, Erwan Lagarde.
Erwan Lagarde from the French Art School. Just wanted to tie together a number of questions and remarks from earlier today. Julian's point about what to expect from the upcoming summits, NATO and the US-EU summit, of course, at the end of this week, as well as Charles's point about what kind of influence and impact this type of report can have. I mean, my question simply is, did you time your visit to the US with a view to the summits at the end of the weekend, and especially if you, I understand you're off to DC after your stop in Boston, and so just a primer on the US-EU summit on your part, and if you expect it to be an encouraging reflection of some of the ideas that you have in the report at all.
Our visit in the United States started on a Monday yesterday. We expect, of course, that by Saturday everybody will be convinced and that this report will become the doctrine of the Obama administration. There is little doubt about that.
Yes, hi. Richard Setti, I'm from the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. A couple of maybe contributing observations and then a question, I hope a simple question for the panel. But I've been teaching on the European Union since having Navy career in Europe for several years, for the last decade in Newport. The student body there is mid-grade professionals in their 10th to 15th to 18th year of profession. It includes 100 or more than 100 international naval officers, 40% of whom since 1955 have gone on to lead their navies. So a very select group of naval officers for a one-year fellowship there. Since I've been teaching, and I will share the bit of decline, there is a bit of decline that I've sort of seen in certain aspects of decline. The course was oversubscribed in 2000, 2001, 2002, etc. And in the last decade now, I'm down to 10 students. Now that could either be attributed to me or there is a huge rush to the Chinese courses that we offer now, and no interest whatsoever for the professionalism of understanding the evolution and the advent of the EU, which is the focus of my course. And of course, I would suggest that rushing to the Chinese courses is how to act in war, and rush to the EU courses might be how to prevent war, along the lines of your ideals for European and transatlantic relationship. And I would like to see more students interested in how to prevent than how to actually fight, though we have to know both. So that's sort of a decline for me, and it's been an interesting one given all of what's happened the last decade between Europe and America. The question I had was, of the three conditions, which do you feel on the panel is the one that's most unachievable or less optimistic about? The ground rules, are we going to agree to ground rules in some sense? Sovereignty within the European states themselves, and to the degree that they give that up along the lines of what sovereignty means or doesn't mean. And lastly, American singular power or view of itself as the hegemony. Which do you think is the least likely that we're going to achieve so that we can move forward?
Well, again, let me say a couple of things, and I'm sure that Laurent will complement. In a way, this report is as much about globalization and the way to address the challenges posed by the globalization as it is about the EU-US relationships. It could have been presented in reverse term and be as a report about globalization that asks at some point what the EU can do, what the United States can do, what they can do together. As to your question, the second and the third condition are the European face of the coin and the American face of the coin. The Europeans are, so to speak, below standard because they have not completed their own program of union, and this makes them an ineffective player on the global scene, but as we have seen, also in a fundamentally EU-US construct such as NATO. The United States are above standard in the way that have such a, I mean, I'm making a caricature, but there is an element of hypertrophic notion of sovereignty, which leads into the dream of hegemony and be the organizer of the world. So in a way, these are two ways to be excessively prisoner or captive of what I think is called in the report, or I've called in other occasions, a Westphalian vision of the global relationship, of the international relationship. I think these are the two. This is the main difficulty, and one can think that the difficulty is unsurmountable. But I would say what I said at the beginning, namely that there are examples in which we are already in a post-Westphalian world. And in any event, this has to be seen as a process, not as a one step. It's not like, you know, calling a Philadelphia Convention and writing the constitution of the world and entering the area of global federalism. This is not true even for Europe. It will be even less true for the world. It was true in Philadelphia for a number of reasons which are completely different from the situation of the world today. And one could say that both the attempt to exit from World War I and from World War II reserve some room for the creation of a global order based on law, etc. It failed once. It made a little more progress the second time, but it's clearly completely inadequate. So it's a long historical process. But I personally have no doubt that this is the only way to avoid today. By now, is the only way to avoid self-destruction of the planet.
We have to come to a close, Louis. So may I ask the last question to the former central banker who was present at the creation? We are submitted on a daily basis, if you read the Financial Times, to the prediction of the imminent demise of the eurozone, and the New York Times occasionally does the same thing. How do you assess the future of the euro now, given all the problems, the way they were dealt with since last?
Let me start with Britain. The fortunes of Britain, for an Italian, this is very clear because we had exactly the same within Italy, with Venice playing the role that Britain played vis-à-vis Europe. For centuries, the unification of the continent was seen by Britain as a threat. As a threat to their own security, just as for Venice, the unification of Italy. Venice spent centuries organizing coalitions of Italian states against the state that at that moment was in the process or at the risk of uniting the peninsula. Britain did exactly the same. You have in common, you have in common the language, although many people say that the real difference between Britain and the United States is the language. Still, you speak the same language. So your sources of information are the Financial Times, and namely information that derive from the same attitude. The United Kingdom is still considering that unification of Europe is a danger. Not as big as when the unifier was Napoleon, but still a danger, something that should be avoided if possible. And the idea that this attempt will never work is so deeply rooted that it's conveyed innocently, unconsciously by most observers. It's in the mind of most traders in the dealing rooms. It is in the mind of most economists I know. And the power of the English language is a formidable carrier of these ideas, because people don't read in French, in German. If they did read as many German or French newspapers as they read British newspapers, in this country they would have a different picture. This is bad business, among other things, because all those who bet on the collapse of the euro will lose their money. Have already lost a lot of money and will keep losing their money because it will not collapse.
Well, that's a very
optimistic.
That's a very good note.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.